On a cold morning in 476 AD, a young barbarian king named Odoacer stood before the gates of Ravenna, the last capital of the Western Roman Empire. The city that had once ruled the known world, stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, now trembled before a force it could no longer resist. Inside the palace, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a boy barely 16 years old, prepared to surrender the crown that had symbolized power for over 500 years. The purple cloak, the scepter, the diadem, all the trappings of imperial majesty would soon be sent eastward to Constantinople, acknowledging that there was no longer a need for a Western emperor. This moment marked not just the end of an empire, but the closing of an era that had shaped Western civilization forever. How did Rome, a city that began as a small settlement on 7 hills along the Tiber River, grow to dominate 3 continents? How did a republic that championed law and citizenship transform into an empire that brought unprecedented peace and prosperity? And how did this seemingly invincible empire, which had survived Hannibal, civil wars and barbarian invasions, finally crumble into dust? The story of Rome is a tale of ambition and hubris, of conquest and glory, of resilience and ultimately decline. A journey that spans over 1,000 years and teaches us profound lessons about power, institutions, and the cycles of history. It is a story that begins not with an ending, but with a beginning, in a time when Rome was just one of many small city-states competing for survival in the Italian peninsula. But to understand this ending, we must journey back to the beginning. Over a millennium before Odoacer's victory, around 753 BC, a different story was unfolding on the Italian peninsula. According to legend, twin brothers Romulus and Remus, sons of the war god Mars and a Vestal virgin, were abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf in a cave on the Palatine Hill. When they reached adulthood, they decided to found a city, but disagreed on its location. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, Remus the Aventine. In the dispute that followed, Romulus killed Remus and became the sole founder and first king of Rome, giving the city his name. Whether this is myth or history, archaeologists have found evidence of early settlement on the Palatine Hill dating to the 8th century BC. This origin story captures something essential about Rome. From its very birth, it was marked by conflict, ambition, fratricide, and an unshakable belief in its destiny. The 7 hills of Rome, Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal, would become the foundation of an empire that would stretch from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine to the Nile, encompassing over 2 million square miles at its peak. This is the story of how a small Italian city-state, surrounded by powerful neighbors, became the master of the Mediterranean world, and how that mastery eventually led to its undoing through overextension, internal decay, and external pressures. The Roman Empire's story is one of the most dramatic narratives in human history, a saga that shaped Western civilization and continues to influence our world today. It encompasses the rise of a republic that championed law, citizenship, and the rule of law over arbitrary power, principles that would inspire democratic movements for millennia. It tells of the transformation into an empire that brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to millions, the Pax Romana, a period of stability and cultural flourishing that lasted for over 2 centuries. And it chronicles the slow, complex decline that took centuries to unfold, a gradual process of internal decay and external pressure that offers profound lessons about the fragility of civilizations. This is not merely a story of conquest and collapse, but a comprehensive study of how institutions evolve, how power corrupts, how external pressures reshape civilizations, and how the seeds of destruction are often sown during times of greatest success. It is a story of individuals, Caesar, Augustus, Constantine, whose decisions shaped history, and of forces beyond any individual's control, economic pressures, demographic changes, climate shifts, and the movement of peoples. Over the next hour, we will trace Rome's journey from its humble origins as a small settlement on 7 hills, through its golden age as master of the Mediterranean, to its final days when barbarian kings replaced Roman emperors. We will explore the forces that built this colossus: military excellence, political innovation, cultural integration, and the forces that brought it down: overextension, internal division, economic collapse, and external invasion. This is more than history. It is a mirror reflecting timeless truths about power, ambition, resilience, and the human condition. In the early days, around 500 BC, Rome was just one of many city-states competing for dominance in the Italian peninsula, a region of remarkable diversity and constant conflict. To the north, the Etruscans had built a sophisticated civilization with extensive trade networks, advanced metalworking, and a rich artistic tradition. Their cities, like Veii and Tarquinii, were larger and more prosperous than early Rome. To the south, Greek colonists had established thriving city-states like Neapolis, Naples, Tarentum, and Syracuse, bringing with them philosophy, art, architecture, and advanced military tactics like the phalanx formation. In the mountainous interior, the Samnites controlled vast territories and fielded formidable armies. The Latins, Rome's immediate neighbors and linguistic kin, formed a loose confederation that sometimes cooperated and sometimes competed. Rome's initial advantage was not military might. Its army was small and relatively unsophisticated, nor cultural superiority. It borrowed heavily from Etruscans and Greeks. Instead, its strength lay in something more fundamental: its strategic location. Situated on the Tiber River, Rome controlled a crucial crossing point where the river was narrow enough to bridge but wide enough for trade. The 7 hills provided natural defense, making the city difficult to besiege. Salt from the nearby salt flats was a valuable commodity. But more importantly, Rome developed a unique political system that would become its greatest strength. Unlike the Greek city-states with their constant internal strife between democrats and oligarchs, or the Eastern monarchies with their absolute rulers who could be capricious and tyrannical, Rome created something new: a republic where citizens had rights protected by law, where power was divided among different institutions, and where service to the state was both duty and honor. This system would prove remarkably resilient and adaptable, allowing Rome to incorporate conquered peoples and expand far beyond what its initial resources suggested was possible. The Roman Republic, established around 509 BC after the expulsion of the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud, was built on principles that seem remarkably modern and would influence political thinkers for millennia. Power was carefully divided among different branches, creating a system of checks and balances that prevented any single individual or group from becoming too powerful. The Senate, composed of Rome's elite families, the patricians, provided wisdom, continuity, and institutional memory. These were men who had served as magistrates, commanded armies, and understood the complexities of governance. The assemblies, where all citizens could vote, regardless of social class, gave voice to the people and ensured that popular will could not be completely ignored. The Centuriate Assembly elected magistrates and voted on war and peace. The Tribal Assembly passed laws and elected tribunes. The consuls, elected annually and always in pairs, held executive power but were checked by each other. Each could veto the other's decisions, and by the system itself. They could not serve consecutive terms, preventing the accumulation of personal power. The tribunes of the plebs, elected by the common people, had the power to veto any action by magistrates or the Senate, protecting the rights of ordinary citizens. This separation of powers, this system of checks and balances, prevented tyranny and ensured that decisions required consensus. But the Republic's true genius lay not just in its internal structure, but in its ability to incorporate conquered peoples. Unlike other empires that simply subjugated their subjects, extracting tribute and resources while keeping them as second-class subjects, Rome offered a path to citizenship. Defeated enemies could become Romans, bringing their skills, their soldiers, and their loyalty to the growing state. This policy of integration, combined with military excellence, political stability, and a legal system that applied to all citizens, created an expansion machine unlike any the world had seen. It allowed Rome to grow from a small city-state to a vast empire, while maintaining relative stability and internal cohesion. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula through a combination of military prowess, political acumen, and strategic alliances. The Samnite Wars had tested Roman resolve and military skill. The conquest of the Greek cities in southern Italy had brought Rome into contact with Hellenistic culture and advanced military tactics. But a greater challenge loomed across the Mediterranean Sea: Carthage. This Phoenician city-state in North Africa, founded by colonists from Tyre around 814 BC, had built a maritime empire that controlled trade routes throughout the western Mediterranean. Its navy was unmatched, its merchant fleet brought wealth from across the known world, and its possessions included parts of Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and most importantly, Sicily, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Carthage's wealth dwarfed Rome's, and its naval expertise was legendary. The two powers, one a land-based republic expanding outward, the other a sea-based commercial empire protecting its interests, were destined to clash. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over control of Sicily, when a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines appealed to both Rome and Carthage for help. What started as a local dispute quickly escalated into a full-scale war. For 23 grueling years, Rome and Carthage fought a brutal conflict that tested both nations to their limits. Rome, traditionally a land power with little naval experience, had to learn naval warfare almost overnight. They built fleets from scratch, trained sailors, and adapted their land-based tactics to sea combat, even creating the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to fight hand-to-hand on enemy ships. The war cost hundreds of thousands of lives, saw multiple naval disasters, and nearly bankrupted both sides. But when it ended in 241 BC, Rome emerged victorious, gaining Sicily as its first overseas province and establishing itself as a Mediterranean power. However, this was only the beginning. The seeds of a far greater conflict had been planted, and both sides knew that the struggle for Mediterranean dominance was far from over. The Second Punic War would become one of the most dramatic conflicts in ancient history, a struggle that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world, and it began with one of the greatest military minds the world has ever known, Hannibal Barca. Son of the great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had made his son swear eternal hatred of Rome, Hannibal had grown up in Spain, learning warfare and leadership from his father. When he took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain at the age of 26, he was already a seasoned commander. In 218 BC, this brilliant strategist did what the Romans considered impossible. He led an army of 40,000 men, a mix of Carthaginians, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, and other allies, along with 37 war elephants, across the treacherous Alps into Italy. The journey was brutal beyond description. The army had to navigate narrow mountain passes, cross raging rivers, and endure freezing temperatures. Thousands died from cold, starvation, exhaustion, and attacks by hostile mountain tribes. The elephants, unused to the cold and difficult terrain, suffered terribly. But through sheer determination and brilliant leadership, Hannibal emerged in northern Italy with an army that, though reduced in numbers, struck terror into Roman hearts. His first major victory came at the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, where he used the terrain to create a perfect ambush, trapping a Roman army of 25,000 men between the lake and the hills. The consul Gaius Flaminius was killed, and Rome was thrown into panic. But the worst was yet to come. At Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal would achieve one of the most perfect tactical victories in military history, demonstrating tactical genius that military academies still study today, destroying a Roman force twice his size and bringing the Republic to the very brink of collapse. August 2, 216 BC. The fields of Cannae in southern Italy near the Aufidus River became the stage for one of history's greatest military disasters and one of the most perfect tactical victories ever achieved. The Roman consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus had assembled an army of 86,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever fielded in a single battle. This included 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, organized in the traditional Roman formation: heavy infantry in the center, lighter troops on the flanks, and cavalry on the wings. Confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, they outnumbered Hannibal more than 2 to 1. The Romans advanced on Hannibal's force of 40,000 men. But Hannibal had chosen his ground carefully, positioning his army with the Aufidus River, protecting one flank, and understanding Roman tactics perfectly. He knew the Romans would attack head-on, relying on their superior numbers and discipline. As the Roman legions pressed forward in their traditional dense formation, Hannibal's center, composed of his least experienced troops, the Gauls and Iberians, deliberately gave way, creating a crescent shape that bulged inward. The Romans, thinking victory was at hand, pushed deeper into the trap, their formation becoming compressed and losing its flexibility. Then, at the critical moment, Hannibal's elite African infantry, veterans of years of campaigning, struck from both sides like a closing vice. Simultaneously, his superior Numidian and Spanish cavalry, having routed the smaller Roman cavalry force, attacked from behind. The Roman army was completely surrounded, compressed into a killing zone where they could neither advance nor retreat effectively. The slaughter that followed was systematic and merciless. By day's end, 50,000 Romans lay dead on the field, including Consul Paulus, 80 senators who had volunteered to serve as officers, and thousands of Rome's best soldiers. Only about 10,000 managed to escape. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, a catastrophe that seemed to signal the end of the Republic. Hannibal now stood between Rome and complete destruction, and it seemed that nothing could stop him from marching on the city itself. But Rome did not surrender. Instead, the Republic showed its greatest strength, resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Even as Hannibal camped outside their walls, even as their allies defected, even as their armies were destroyed, the Senate refused to negotiate. "We will never surrender," they declared. Instead, they adopted a strategy of attrition that would test Roman patience and discipline. Under the leadership of Quintus Fabius Maximus, known as the Delayer or Cunctator, Roman forces avoided pitched battles with Hannibal, recognizing that he was tactically superior. Instead, they harassed his supply lines, attacked his allies, recaptured lost cities, and waited. This Fabian strategy was deeply unpopular. Romans wanted glory, honor, and decisive victories, not patience and delay. Fabius was mocked and criticized, but his strategy worked. It prevented further disasters and gave Rome time to rebuild its armies and learn from its mistakes. Meanwhile, a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio was studying Hannibal's tactics, learning from the master. Scipio had seen his father and uncle killed fighting the Carthaginians in Spain, and he was determined to avenge them. In 204 BC, after conquering Spain and eliminating Carthaginian power there, Scipio took the war to Africa, landing with an army and forcing Hannibal to return home to defend Carthage itself. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio faced Hannibal on the field. But this time, the student had become the master. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him, including a double envelopment, and achieved a decisive victory. Hannibal's elephants were turned against his own lines, his cavalry was routed, and his infantry was destroyed. Carthage was forced to surrender, giving up its empire in Spain, its navy, and paying massive reparations that would cripple it for decades. Rome had survived its greatest test and emerged as the undisputed dominant power in the Mediterranean. But victory came at a cost that would reshape the Republic forever. The legions were now professional armies, loyal to successful generals, wealth flowed unequally, and the traditional balance of the Republic was beginning to shift. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 BC, was less a war than an execution, a final act of destruction that would eliminate Rome's greatest rival forever. After the Second Punic War, Carthage had been stripped of its empire and forced to pay massive reparations. But it had recovered economically through trade and agriculture. However, it remained militarily weak, forbidden by treaty from raising an army or navy. In Rome, the memory of Hannibal's invasion and the devastation he had caused remained fresh. Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, a senator who had fought in the Second Punic War, ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum." This relentless campaign of fear and hatred eventually took hold. When Carthage finally violated a treaty by defending itself against Numidian attacks that Rome had encouraged, Rome had its pretext for war. Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, was given command and besieged Carthage for 3 years. The city, built on a peninsula with strong fortifications, resisted fiercely. When the city finally fell in 146 BC, after brutal street fighting, the Romans systematically destroyed it. They burned it to the ground, methodically demolishing every building. They salted the earth so nothing would grow. Though this may be legend, the intent was clear: to ensure Carthage would never rise again. The surviving population, estimated at 50,000, was sold into slavery. The destruction was so complete that when the Romans later built a new city on the site, modern archaeologists struggle to find traces of Punic Carthage beneath the Roman ruins. With Carthage gone, Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, with no serious rival remaining. But victory brought new problems that would test the Republic in ways it had never been tested before. How to govern an empire, how to manage unprecedented wealth, and how to maintain republican institutions when power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of successful generals. The Punic Wars had transformed Rome, but the changes were just beginning. Victory brought unprecedented wealth, but it flowed unequally. The senatorial class grew fabulously rich from conquest and trade, while small farmers, who had served in the legions for years, returned to find their farms in ruins. Many were forced to sell their land to wealthy aristocrats, who consolidated it into vast estates worked by slaves captured in war. The traditional backbone of the Republic, the independent farmer-soldier, was disappearing. Meanwhile, the legions themselves were changing. What had once been a citizen militia serving for the common good was becoming a professional army, loyal more to successful generals than to the Republic itself. These tensions would explode in a series of civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Republic and give birth to the Empire. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, attempted to address these problems through land reform. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, as tribune of the plebs, proposed redistributing public land to the poor. The idea was popular with the people, but threatened the interests of the wealthy. When Tiberius tried to stand for re-election, unconstitutional but not unprecedented, his opponents in the Senate organized a mob that beat him and 300 of his followers to death. This was the first time in Roman history that political violence had been used so openly. 10 years later, his brother Gaius took up the cause, proposing even more radical reforms, including citizenship for Italian allies. Again, the Senate responded with violence. Gaius and 3,000 of his supporters were killed in street fighting. The Republic's tradition of resolving disputes through law and debate was breaking down. The age of political violence had begun. The next crisis came from an unexpected source: a slave revolt. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus escaped from a training school in Capua. Joined by other slaves, he formed an army that grew to 70,000 men. For 2 years, Spartacus and his followers defeated every Roman force sent against them, ravaging the Italian countryside and striking fear into the heart of Rome. The slave army marched north, hoping to cross the Alps and escape to freedom. But then, for reasons that remain unclear, Spartacus turned south again. Perhaps he hoped to cross to Sicily, or perhaps his followers refused to leave Italy. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal mistake. The Senate, finally taking the threat seriously, gave command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Crassus cornered Spartacus in southern Italy, and in 71 BC destroyed the slave army. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. The Republic had survived, but its confidence was shaken. The social war of 91 to 88 BC revealed another deep crack in the Republic's foundation. Rome's Italian allies, who had fought alongside Romans for generations, demanded full citizenship rights. When the Senate refused, the allies rebelled, forming their own state called Italia. The war was brutal and costly, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Eventually, Rome won militarily, but the real victory came through compromise. Citizenship was extended to all Italians. This expansion of the citizen body was necessary, but it also fundamentally changed the nature of the Republic. The old system, designed for a small city-state, was now trying to govern an empire. The personal bonds and shared values that had held the early Republic together were weakening. The stage was set for strongmen who could command loyalty across vast distances. The final crisis of the Republic came in the form of three men who would reshape Rome forever: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. In 60 BC, these three formed the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance that effectively controlled the Republic. Caesar, ambitious and brilliant, took command in Gaul, where he spent 8 years conquering territory and building a loyal army. His commentaries on the Gallic War became a masterpiece of propaganda, portraying himself as a hero, while sending back wealth that made him popular in Rome. Meanwhile, Pompey had become Rome's greatest general, having conquered the East and expanded the empire dramatically. Crassus, already fabulously wealthy, sought military glory to match his partners. But when Crassus was killed fighting the Parthians in 53 BC, the delicate balance of the triumvirate collapsed. Caesar and Pompey were left as rivals, and civil war became inevitable. In 49 BC, the crisis that had been building for years finally came to a head. The Senate, dominated by Pompey's supporters and traditionalists who saw Caesar as a threat to the Republic, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar had spent the past decade conquering Gaul, building a loyal army, and accumulating wealth and popularity. His commentaries on the Gallic War had made him a hero to the Roman people. But his enemies in the Senate, led by Cato and supported by Pompey, feared his power and ambition. They demanded he give up his command before standing for consul, knowing that as a private citizen, he would be vulnerable to prosecution for his actions during his consulship years earlier. Caesar knew that returning without his army meant political destruction, possibly exile or even death. He tried to negotiate, offering to give up most of his provinces and armies, keeping only Illyricum and 2 legions until he could stand for consul. But his enemies, confident in their position, refused all compromise. On January 10, 49 BC, standing on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper, Caesar faced the most momentous decision of his life. To cross with an army was illegal. It was declaring war on the Republic itself. But to return without his army was to accept political destruction. After hours of hesitation, he made the fateful decision. "The die is cast," he reportedly said in Greek, "alia iacta est," and crossed the river with his single legion, the 13th. What followed was a lightning campaign that stunned his enemies. Caesar moved with stunning speed, covering 200 miles in a week, catching his opponents completely off guard. City after city opened its gates to him. Pompey, realizing he couldn't defend Rome, and most of the Senate fled to Greece, taking the treasury with them. Within 60 days, Caesar controlled all of Italy without a single major battle. But the war was far from over. Pompey still commanded legions in the east, controlled the seas with his navy, and had the support of most of the Senate and the eastern provinces. The decisive battle would come the following year at Pharsalus, where the fate of the Republic would be decided. August 9, 48 BC. The plains of Pharsalus in central Greece became the stage for the decisive battle of the Civil War, a confrontation that would determine whether the Roman Republic would survive or be replaced by something new. Pompey commanded 45,000 men, 45,000 infantry, and 7,000 cavalry, significantly outnumbering Caesar's force of 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The senatorial forces were confident, their cavalry vastly superior in numbers, their position on high ground strong, and their supply lines secure. Pompey's advisors urged him to use his cavalry advantage to outflank Caesar's smaller force. But Caesar understood his enemy perfectly. He had fought alongside Pompey for years and knew his tactics. He anticipated that Pompey's cavalry would try to outflank his right wing, so he placed his best, most experienced infantry, the 10th Legion and other veteran units, in reserve behind his right wing, hidden from view. When Pompey's massive cavalry force charged, expecting an easy victory against Caesar's thin right flank, they met not just infantry, but a wall of javelins thrown at point-blank range, followed by disciplined soldiers fighting with their swords. The unexpected resistance, combined with the ferocity of Caesar's veterans, broke the cavalry charge. The horsemen fled in panic, and Caesar's forces then executed a perfect envelopment, attacking Pompey's left flank from the side and rear. The senatorial army, caught between Caesar's main force and his enveloping troops, collapsed. Pompey, seeing his army disintegrating, fled the field, abandoning his men. He would later be murdered in Egypt by agents of the young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. The Republic, as it had existed for 500 years, with its balance of power, its checks and balances, its tradition of resolving disputes through law and debate, was effectively dead. Caesar was now the undisputed master of Rome, and the question was not whether the Republic would be replaced, but what would take its place: a monarchy, a dictatorship, or some new form of government that had never been seen before. Caesar returned to Rome as dictator, but he tried to rule with a light touch, attempting to reconcile rather than destroy. He pardoned his enemies, including many who had fought against him, hoping to heal the divisions that had torn the Republic apart. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would be used for over 1,600 years. He initiated massive public works projects, planned to drain the Pontine marshes, and envisioned further conquests, including an invasion of Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat. He extended citizenship to more people, reformed the administration of the provinces, and tried to address the economic problems that plagued Rome. But many senators, especially those who remembered the Republic and its traditions, saw him as a tyrant who had destroyed the very system they had sworn to protect. They watched with growing alarm as he accumulated more and more power, as he was declared dictator for life, as he was honored with titles and honors that seemed to elevate him above other mortals. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a conspiracy of 60 senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had treated like a son, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, assassinated Caesar in the Senate House. As Caesar entered the Curia of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting, the conspirators surrounded him. When he reached his seat, they attacked, stabbing him 23 times. Caesar, seeing Brutus among his attackers, reportedly said, "You too, my child?" in Greek, "Kai su teknon?" and died at the foot of Pompey's statue, a moment of supreme irony. The assassins believed they were saving the Republic, restoring the old order, but they had miscalculated catastrophically. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. Instead, it unleashed another round of civil war that would be even more destructive than the first. Caesar's adopted son Octavian, his friend and deputy Mark Antony, and his former deputy Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate and systematically hunted down the assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were defeated and committed suicide. The Republic was truly dead, killed not by Caesar, but by the civil wars that his assassination had unleashed. The question now was not whether Rome would have a new form of government, but who would rule the new order, and what that order would look like. The final act of the Republic's death came in a struggle between Octavian and Mark Antony, two men who had been allies but were now rivals for control of Rome. After the defeat of the assassins at Philippi, the Second Triumvirate had divided the Roman world. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and Lepidus took Africa. but the alliance was fragile. Antony had gone to the east to prepare for a campaign against Parthia, but he had become entangled with Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman of remarkable intelligence, charisma, and ambition. Together, they seemed to pose a threat to Rome itself. Antony had divorced Octavian's sister to marry Cleopatra, and rumors spread that he planned to move the capital to Alexandria and make Cleopatra's children his heirs. Octavian skillfully used this to paint Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Roman values for an Eastern queen, who had been corrupted by Eastern luxury and decadence. The propaganda war was intense, with both sides using every means available, speeches, pamphlets, public displays, to win the hearts and minds of the Roman people. When it came to actual war, Octavian was ready. His friend and admiral Marcus Agrippa had built a powerful fleet and trained it to perfection. At the Battle of Actium on September 2, 31 BC, in the Ionian Sea off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet of 400 ships, commanded by Agrippa, faced Antony and Cleopatra's combined force of 500 ships. But numbers meant little when tactics and leadership mattered more. Agrippa's superior tactics and the discipline of Octavian's forces proved decisive. As the battle turned against them, Cleopatra's ships suddenly broke away and fled, and Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his own fleet to follow. The remaining ships surrendered or were destroyed. The lovers fled to Egypt, where they would both commit suicide the following year when Octavian's forces closed in. Octavian was now the undisputed master of Rome and the entire Roman world. But he was careful, learning from Caesar's mistakes. He did not call himself king or dictator. Instead, in 27 BC, he took the name Augustus, the revered one, and the title First Citizen, or Princeps. The Republic was officially restored, the Senate and assemblies continued to meet, the old institutions remained, but everyone knew that real power lay with Augustus. The Roman Empire had begun, though it was called a restored republic, to maintain the fiction that the old order still existed.
The age of Augustus, from 27 BC to 14 AD, marked the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity that would last for over 200 years. This was Rome's golden age, a time when the empire reached its cultural and economic peak. Augustus reformed the government with remarkable skill, creating a system that maintained the appearance of the Republic. The Senate still met, magistrates were still elected, laws were still passed, while concentrating real power in his hands. He held multiple offices simultaneously, controlled the military, managed the treasury, and directed foreign policy, all while maintaining the fiction that he was merely the first among equals. He rebuilt Rome on a grand scale, famously saying he found it a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples were restored, new forums were built, aqueducts were constructed, and public spaces were beautified. The arts flourished as never before. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic poem that linked Rome's origins to the Trojan hero Aeneas and established Rome's divine destiny. Livy wrote his massive history of Rome, preserving the stories and traditions of the Republic. Ovid composed his masterpieces of love poetry and mythology. Horace wrote odes celebrating Roman virtues. Trade flourished across the empire, with goods flowing from Britain to India, from the Rhine to the Nile. The legions secured the frontiers, building walls, forts, and roads that would last for centuries. For the first time in generations, Romans could live without constant fear of civil war, invasion, or political violence. But this golden age contained the seeds of future problems. The system depended entirely on finding capable, virtuous successors, and Augustus struggled with this throughout his reign. His chosen heirs died before him, forcing him to adopt his stepson Tiberius as his successor. The question of succession would plague the empire for centuries, and not every emperor would be an Augustus. Some would be capable administrators, others would be tyrants, and the system had no mechanism to remove bad rulers except assassination or civil war. The problem of succession would plague the empire for centuries. Augustus's successors included capable rulers like Trajan and Hadrian, but also tyrants like Caligula and Nero.
Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, began his reign promisingly, but descended into madness, declaring himself a god, planning to make his horse a consul, and terrorizing the Senate. He was assassinated by his own guards. Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, was initially popular, but became increasingly erratic. When much of Rome burned in the Great Fire of 64 AD, Nero was accused of fiddling while the city burned. Likely false, but the story stuck. He blamed Christians for the fire and began the first systematic persecution. Nero's excesses and failures led to rebellion, and he committed suicide in 68 AD, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The year that followed saw 4 different emperors, showing how fragile the system had become.
The 2nd century AD brought Rome to its territorial peak under the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These rulers, chosen for ability rather than birth, expanded and secured the empire. Trajan pushed the frontiers to their greatest extent, conquering Dacia and Mesopotamia. Hadrian built his famous wall in Britain and traveled throughout the empire, personally inspecting and improving defenses. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent much of his reign fighting Germanic tribes on the Danube frontier, all while writing his Meditations, one of history's greatest works of philosophy. But even this golden age had warning signs. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire was enormous. The legions were stretched thin, and when Marcus Aurelius's son Commodus succeeded him, the quality of leadership declined sharply. The age of the philosopher-emperors was ending. The 3rd century AD brought crisis after crisis, a perfect storm of disasters that nearly destroyed the empire and tested its survival to the absolute limit. The period from 235 to 284 AD is known as the crisis of the 3rd century, and it represents one of the most dangerous periods in Roman history. In just 50 years, there were over 25 different emperors, most of them murdered by their own troops or rivals, in a cycle of violence that seemed endless. The problem of succession, which had always been the empire's weakness, became catastrophic. Emperors were made and unmade by the legions, who had learned that they could choose their own rulers. The frontiers collapsed under simultaneous pressure from multiple enemies. Germanic tribes, the Alemanni, Franks, and Goths, pressed across the Rhine and Danube. The Sassanid Persians, a powerful new dynasty in the east, invaded and captured the Emperor Valerian, who died in captivity. Other enemies, the Carpi, the Sarmatians, various barbarian confederations, took advantage of Rome's weakness. The economy spiraled into hyperinflation as the government, desperate for funds to pay for constant warfare, debased the currency repeatedly. The silver content of coins dropped from nearly pure silver to almost nothing, destroying confidence in the monetary system. Trade collapsed, prices soared, and the economy moved toward a barter system. To make matters worse, a devastating plague, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through the empire, killing millions and depopulating cities and countryside alike. Cities were sacked, farms were abandoned, and the Roman world seemed to be coming apart at the seams. It was during this chaos that the empire actually split into 3 pieces. The Gallic Empire in the west, ruled by a series of breakaway emperors, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, led by Queen Zenobia, who briefly controlled Egypt, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor, and the central Roman state, struggling to survive. The very existence of Rome, the idea of a unified empire, was in question. Many must have believed that the end had come. The empire was saved, at least temporarily, by a series of soldier emperors who restored order through military strength. The most important was Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD. Recognizing that the empire was too large for one man to govern, he divided it into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. He also created the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, to ensure smooth succession. Diocletian stabilized the currency, reorganized the administration, and secured the frontiers. But his reforms came at a cost. To pay for the expanded military and bureaucracy, taxes increased dramatically. The economy was more controlled, less free, and the division between East and West, while practical, would eventually become permanent. When Diocletian retired in 305 AD, the only emperor to voluntarily give up power, civil war broke out again as rivals fought for control. Out of the civil wars that followed Diocletian's retirement in 305 AD, emerged Constantine the Great, a figure who would transform the empire in ways that still shape our world today. Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's Caesars, came to power after a series of brutal battles against his rivals. The most famous of these was at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome on October 28, 312 AD, where he faced Maxentius, who controlled Italy and North Africa. According to Christian sources, the night before the battle, Constantine saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer," in hoc signo vinces, in Latin. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi Rho symbol, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, on their shields. Whether this vision was real, a dream, or political calculation, Constantine was a master propagandist. His conversion to Christianity was momentous, one of the most significant events in Western history. The next year, in 313 AD, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity, which had been persecuted sporadically for centuries and systematically under Diocletian, was now not just tolerated, but actively favored. Constantine built churches, convened the Council of Nicaea to establish Christian doctrine, and began the process of making Christianity the dominant religion of the empire. But Constantine's impact went beyond religion. He also moved the imperial capital from Rome to a new city he built on the site of ancient Byzantium, Constantinople, the new Rome. This shift eastward reflected the changing center of gravity of the empire, where the wealthier, more populated, more economically productive eastern provinces were becoming more important than the west. Constantinople would become the greatest city in Europe for 1,000 years, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. Constantine's reign marked a turning point in Roman history, a transformation that would reshape not just the empire, but Western civilization itself. He not only legalized Christianity, but actively promoted it, building magnificent churches throughout the empire, the Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and many others. In 325 AD, he convened the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, bringing together over 300 bishops from across the empire to establish Christian doctrine and resolve theological disputes. The council produced the Nicene Creed, which defined Orthodox Christian belief and is still recited in churches today. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD had granted religious freedom, ending centuries of persecution, but Constantine went further, making Christianity the favored religion. He gave tax exemptions to the clergy, funded church construction, and began the process of Christianizing Roman law and society. This transformation had profound and lasting consequences. The old pagan traditions that had united Rome for centuries, the worship of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the other gods, began to fade, though they would persist in some form for another century. New conflicts emerged between different Christian factions, Arians, Donatists, and others, creating religious divisions that would plague the empire. The emperor's role changed fundamentally, from protector of traditional Roman religion to defender of the Christian faith, a shift that would influence the relationship between church and state for over 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the move to Constantinople shifted the empire's center of gravity permanently eastward. The western provinces, already struggling economically, depopulated by plague and warfare, became increasingly peripheral. The seeds of division were being sown, and within a century, the Eastern and Western empires would go their separate ways, with the East surviving for another 1,000 years, while the West would collapse. The division between East and West became increasingly pronounced in the 4th and 5th centuries, a split that would prove fatal to the Western Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, remained wealthy, populous, and relatively stable. Its economy was stronger, its population larger, its cities more prosperous.
The eastern provinces had been less affected by the crisis of the 3rd century, and Constantinople's strategic location made it a center of trade and culture. The Western Empire, centered on Rome and later Ravenna, faced mounting pressures from all sides. Germanic tribes, pushed by migrations from Central Asia, themselves possibly driven by climate change or pressure from other peoples, pressed against the frontiers. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, and other peoples sought land, wealth, and security within the empire. The Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, led by the fearsome Attila, terrorized both halves of the empire, extracting tribute and sacking cities. In 410 AD, an event occurred that shocked the Roman world and sent tremors through the entire Mediterranean. Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The Visigoths, originally allies of Rome, who had been mistreated and driven to rebellion, had been wandering through the empire for years, seeking a permanent home. When negotiations broke down, Alaric led his people to Rome. The city's defenses were weak, the legions had been withdrawn to fight elsewhere, and the gates were opened, possibly by slaves or disaffected citizens. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted the city, though they showed some restraint, respecting churches and avoiding wanton destruction. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had fallen to an enemy. The last time had been in 390 BC, when the Gauls had sacked Rome. Though the physical damage was limited, and Alaric soon left, heading south, the psychological impact was devastating. The news spread throughout the empire, shocking Christians and pagans alike. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, declared that the whole world perished in one city. Rome was no longer invincible. The myth of eternal Rome was shattered, and everyone knew that the end was approaching. The Western Empire continued to crumble. Emperors became puppets of Germanic generals. The real power lay with men like Ricimer, a half-Germanic general who controlled a series of puppet emperors. The frontiers collapsed as legions were withdrawn to fight civil wars or simply disbanded for lack of funds. Barbarian kingdoms established themselves within what had been imperial territory. The Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, the Franks in Gaul. The Western Empire was becoming a fiction, a name without substance. By the 470s, the emperor controlled little more than Italy itself, and even that control was tenuous. The end was approaching, and everyone knew it. The question was not if the Western Empire would fall, but when, and what would come after. Attila the Hun, known as the Scourge of God, brought terror to both halves of the empire in the mid-5th century. Leading a confederation of Hunnic and Germanic tribes, Attila ravaged the Balkans, threatened Constantinople, and then turned west. In 451 AD, he invaded Gaul with an army estimated at 100,000 men. The Western Roman general Aetius, recognizing the existential threat, did something unprecedented. He formed an alliance with the Visigoths, traditional enemies of Rome, to face the common danger. At the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, this combined force met Attila's army. The battle was one of the bloodiest in ancient history, with estimates of 150,000 to 300,000 casualties. Though the result was inconclusive, Attila withdrew but was not destroyed, it marked the last time a Roman general would command such a large coalition. The battle showed that Rome could still fight, but only by depending on allies who would soon become masters. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe that had migrated through Gaul and Spain, established a kingdom in North Africa, Rome's breadbasket. Under their king Genseric, the Vandals built a powerful navy and became masters of the western Mediterranean. In 455 AD, they sailed to Italy and sacked Rome itself, an event even more devastating than Alaric's sack 45 years earlier. The Vandals spent 2 weeks systematically looting the city, taking everything of value, including the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem that had been brought to Rome centuries before. The psychological impact was profound. If Rome could be sacked twice in a generation, what protection did any city have? The Western Empire was clearly dying, and everyone knew it. The emperors in Ravenna were powerless to stop the disintegration happening around them. September 4,
476 AD. The final act played out in Ravenna, the last capital of the Western Roman Empire, a city that had been chosen as the imperial residence because of its strategic location and strong fortifications. The emperor, Romulus Augustulus, just 16 years old, had been placed on the throne less than a year earlier by his father Orestes, a Germanic general who had served the empire but was himself of mixed Roman and barbarian heritage. The name Romulus Augustulus, Little Romulus, Little Augustus, was almost cruelly ironic, combining the name of Rome's legendary founder with that of its first emperor. Yet the boy was powerless, a figurehead in a dying empire. Orestes had refused to give land to the Germanic mercenaries who made up much of what remained of the Western Roman army, fearing that such a grant would further weaken imperial authority. In response, the soldiers, frustrated and seeing no future in serving a powerless emperor, chose one of their own, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, as their leader. Odoacer marched on Ravenna with his followers, captured the city easily, there was little resistance, and deposed the young emperor. But he did something unexpected and historically significant. Instead of declaring himself emperor or killing Romulus, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the scepter, the diadem, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, and declared that there was no longer a need for a Western emperor. One emperor, ruling from Constantinople, would be sufficient for the entire Roman world. The Western Roman Empire, which had ruled for over 500 years, which had once stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, which had built roads and aqueducts, created laws and spread culture, was simply declared to be at an end. It was an almost anticlimactic conclusion to a millennium of history. No great battle, no dramatic siege, just a quiet transfer of symbols that marked the end of an era. Romulus Augustulus was not killed, but pensioned off to live in a villa in Campania, where he would spend the rest of his life in obscurity, a living symbol of what had been lost. But the story was not entirely over. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, to distinguish it from the classical Roman Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving and evolving Roman traditions in ways that would influence history for centuries. Constantinople, the new Rome founded by Constantine, remained a bastion of Roman culture, law, and power. Its walls, the strongest in the world, would protect it from countless sieges. Its location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made it a center of trade and culture. Under Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantines experienced a remarkable revival. Justinian's brilliant general Belisarius reconquered Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, briefly restoring much of the Western Empire. The Code of Justinian, a comprehensive compilation of Roman law, would become the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe. The magnificent Hagia Sophia, built during Justinian's reign, remains one of the world's greatest architectural achievements. But these gains were temporary. The costs of reconquest were enormous, and the empire was overstretched. The Eastern Empire faced its own challenges, the rise of Islam in the 7th century, which would cost it Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Pressure from various enemies including Persians, Avars, Bulgars, and later Turks, and internal divisions between religious factions. Yet it endured, preserving Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian faith through the Dark Ages when Western Europe was in chaos. The Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, but by then it had served as a crucial bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, preserving knowledge and culture that would help spark the Renaissance and shape the development of both Eastern and Western civilizations. In the West, the fall of the empire did not mean the end of Roman influence, far from it. Roman law, language, architecture, and culture had become so deeply embedded in the fabric of European society that they could not simply disappear. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced the empire often adopted Roman institutions, recognizing their value and effectiveness. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain produced the Liber Judiciorum, a sophisticated legal code based on Roman law. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, under Theodoric, maintained Roman administration and even employed Roman officials. The Frankish kingdom adopted Roman administrative practices and would become the core
of medieval Europe. The Catholic Church, which had grown powerful in the late Empire, preserved Roman administrative structures using the same organizational methods that had governed the empire. Latin remained the language of learning, law, and religion, ensuring that Roman ideas and texts would be accessible to scholars for centuries. Roman roads continued to be used for centuries, facilitating trade and communication long after the empire fell. Roman aqueducts provided water to medieval cities, some still functioning today. The very idea of empire, the concept of a unified state ruling diverse peoples under a single law, would inspire Charlemagne, the Holy Roman emperors, and later European monarchs. Rome's legacy was not in its political structure, which had failed, but in the cultural and institutional foundations it had laid across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, foundations that would support the development of medieval and modern civilization.
The transition from Roman to medieval Europe was gradual and complex, taking place over centuries rather than happening in a single moment. In some places, like Italy and Gaul, Roman institutions and culture persisted strongly, creating a hybrid civilization that blended Roman and Germanic elements. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, under Theodoric the Great, who ruled from 493 to 526 AD, maintained Roman law and administration almost unchanged. Theodoric, who had been educated in Constantinople and understood Roman ways, employed Roman officials, preserved Roman buildings, and even tried to maintain the Senate. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain produced sophisticated legal codes based on Roman models, showing how Germanic rulers adapted rather than destroyed Roman institutions. Even the Frankish kingdom, which would become the core of medieval Europe under the Merovingian and later Carolingian dynasties, adopted Roman administrative practices, using Roman methods of taxation, record-keeping, and governance. Latin remained the language of learning, law, and religion, ensuring continuity in education and administration. Roman roads continued to facilitate trade and communication, connecting the new kingdoms just as they had connected the empire. The Church, inheriting Roman organizational structures, dioceses, provinces, hierarchical administration, became the primary institution preserving Roman culture. Monasteries copied and preserved Roman texts, ensuring that classical learning would not be lost. This continuity ensured that Roman civilization did not simply vanish, but evolved into new forms, blending with Germanic, Christian, and other influences to create the medieval world, a world that would shape European history for another 1,000 years and beyond. Why did Rome fall? Historians have debated this question for 1,500 years, and there is no single answer. The fall of Rome was the result of a complex interplay of multiple factors that reinforced each other. Some historians point to external pressures, the constant attacks by Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, who pressed against the frontiers, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as allies turned enemies. The Huns, a powerful nomadic confederation from Central Asia, terrorized both halves of the empire, forcing other peoples to migrate into Roman territory. Others emphasize internal decay, political corruption, as the system of succession broke down, leading to constant civil wars. Economic problems including hyperinflation, debased currency, and declining trade. Moral decline, though this is harder to measure and may reflect the biases of Christian writers against pagan Rome. Still others focus on structural issues. The empire was simply too large to govern effectively from a single center, especially with the communication and transportation technology of the time. The cost of defense was unsustainable, maintaining legions on multiple frontiers, building walls and forts, fighting constant wars drained the treasury. The division between East and West, while necessary for administration, created weakness, as the two halves often failed to coordinate and sometimes even fought each other. Climate change may have played a role. Some evidence suggests a period of cooling and drought that affected agriculture. Disease certainly did. The plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries killed millions and depopulated the empire. The truth likely combines all these factors.
The empire faced too many challenges simultaneously: military pressure on multiple frontiers, economic collapse, political instability, social transformation as Christianity replaced paganism, demographic decline, and the breakdown of traditional institutions. No state could have survived such a perfect storm indefinitely. But Rome's fall was not sudden. It took centuries, from the crisis of the 3rd century to the final deposition in 476 AD. And in falling, Rome gave birth to the medieval world, and ultimately to the modern West, as its institutions, laws, language, and culture were preserved and adapted by the peoples who succeeded it. The dream of restoring Rome's glory never died. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica. This act created the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would last for over 1,000 years until 1806. Though it was neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire in the classical sense, it represented the enduring power of the Roman ideal. Charlemagne's court at Aachen became a center of learning, where scholars preserved and copied Roman texts. The Carolingian Renaissance, as it came to be called, was a conscious attempt to revive Roman culture and learning. This pattern would repeat throughout European history. The Renaissance of the 14th–16th centuries, the neoclassical movement of the 18th century, all looked back to Rome as a model of civilization and achievement. The very name Holy Roman Empire shows how deeply the idea of Rome had penetrated European consciousness, becoming not just a historical memory, but an aspiration, a standard against which all subsequent empires would be measured. The Renaissance of the 14th to 16th centuries marked another great revival of Roman culture. Italian humanists like Petrarch and Boccaccio rediscovered Roman literature, philosophy, and art. They studied the ruins of ancient Rome with reverence, copying inscriptions, measuring buildings, and trying to understand how the Romans had achieved such greatness. Artists like Michelangelo and Raphael looked to Roman sculpture and architecture for inspiration. Architects like Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon's dome and Roman engineering techniques. The rediscovery of Roman texts, preserved in monasteries and libraries, sparked a revolution in thought. Roman ideas about law, government, and citizenship influenced the development of modern political theory. Machiavelli's The Prince drew heavily on Roman history. The Renaissance was, in many ways, a conversation with ancient Rome, a dialogue across 1,000 years that would shape the modern world. This intellectual and artistic revival showed that Rome's influence was not just political or military, but cultural and intellectual, reaching across centuries to inspire new generations. Rome's impact on the modern world is immeasurable and extends far beyond Europe. Our legal systems are fundamentally based on Roman law, the concept that laws should be written down, applied equally, and based on reason rather than arbitrary power. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century, became the foundation of European legal systems and influenced legal thinking worldwide. Our languages are filled with Latin roots: English, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian all trace their origins to Latin. Medical terminology, scientific names, legal phrases all use Latin. Our architecture echoes Roman designs. Columns, arches, domes, and vaults are Roman innovations that we still use today. The United States Capitol, the British Parliament, countless courthouses and government buildings worldwide all draw inspiration from Roman architecture. Our concepts of citizenship, republicanism, separation of powers, and representative government all trace back to Rome. The Roman Catholic Church, which preserved learning through the Dark Ages, is a direct continuation of Roman institutions. Even the idea of a unified Europe, attempted many times since Rome's fall, reflects the dream of the Pax Romana. Rome may have fallen, but it never truly died. Its influence is everywhere we look, in our governments, our languages, our art, our laws, and our ideas about what civilization means. The lessons of Rome's rise and fall remain profoundly relevant today, offering warnings and inspiration in equal measure. The Republic fell when its institutions could no longer contain the ambitions of powerful individuals who placed personal gain above the common good. The empire fell when it became too large, too expensive, and too divided to defend itself effectively. These are warnings about the dangers of political polarization, the costs of overextension, the importance of maintaining strong institutions, and the need for balance between central authority and local autonomy. But Rome also teaches us about resilience, about the ability to adapt and survive against overwhelming odds. The Republic survived Hannibal's invasion and the devastation of Cannae. The empire survived the crisis of the 3rd century, when it seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Even after the Western Empire fell, Roman culture and institutions persisted for centuries, evolving and adapting. The story of Rome is ultimately a human story, about ambition and hubris, about greatness and decline, about the eternal struggle to build something lasting in an impermanent world. It reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that power corrupts, but also that ideas can outlive empires, that culture can transcend politics, and that the human spirit can endure even the greatest catastrophes.
From a small settlement on 7 hills to master of the Mediterranean, from republic to empire, from golden age to crisis and decline, the story of Rome spans over 1,000 years of human history. It is a story of extraordinary achievement and profound failure, of individuals who shaped the course of history and forces beyond any individual's control. Rome built aqueducts that still stand, roads that still carry traffic, and laws that still influence us. It created ideas about citizenship and government that we still debate today. It produced art, literature, and architecture that continue to inspire. And when Rome fell, it did not disappear. Instead, it transformed, its legacy living on in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the buildings we admire, and the ideas we hold about civilization itself. The Roman Empire may have ended in 476 AD, but Rome itself is eternal. Its story reminds us that while empires rise and fall, the best of what they create, their ideas, their art, their vision of what humanity can achieve, can endure forever. As we look at the ruins of Rome today, we see not just the end of an empire, but the beginning of a legacy that continues to shape our world.